Okay, so for the yesterday, today, we heard a lot about the Agodjie. And what we try to do with this panel is just tell you a story about what happened after the French came and after Benin got its independence. How's gender representation? So in my case, I'll be focusing on the military, being a former military myself. So my talk will center on the evolution of gender representation within the army, within the military broadly, since the French came to Benin, and so on and so forth. One thing we've learned from yesterday's presentations and today's presentations is that Dahomey had a practice of, female warriors, and we should expect that practice to influence, military practice, military affairs within that country for some time. So we should expect to see military in Benin and Dahomey at the time after the French took over to have some gender representation that matches or at least mirrors what we saw in Dahomey. So for my presentation, I will try to focus on different time periods of the history of Benin since the French came, and then walk you through how the gender representation within the military evolved or was represented throughout history at each of those periods. If you don't, those of you who are online who have not followed the past panels, Benin was colonized by France and became independent in 1960. But between 1890 and 1894, there were a lot of battles. We know from history that on one side of the battle, we had Dahomey with a standing all-female unit. So that was on one hand. And among those female warriors, there were leaders. Okay, and on the other hand, we have the French. And you can see from the table that I have here that actually the French had troops stationed in Dahomey, Cotonou and Porto Novo, by the beginning of the battles of 1890, 1894, and about 1,000 troops from France, both French nationals and the so-called tirailleurs sénégalais. And what we know is no female on records, okay, among those 1,000. And then, they started the war and the French started raising military and enrolling more people. So that's what we can conclude from the time the French entered the region. Now, if you look at the entire colonial period, the French enrolled, military folks from the colony of Dahomey. Now, if you look at the chart on your left, you see that the first enrollments took place within the context of World War I. 1994, 1940, 1915, the first recruits, came in to join the French troops. And what we know is that no female was recruited at the time. And you can see on the table, even Abomey, which was the capital city of Dahomey at the time of the Danxome Kingdom, did provide recruits, and none of them were female. That we know for sure. Until independence in 1960, you can see with the second chart here that the trend I just described was not just for Dahomey. Even the French troops, broadly speaking, in Africa and West Africa in particular, there were no female on records, despite all the high numbers of new recruits that you saw. You can see on the chart right there. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what explains this shift, right? What accounts for this disruption of military practice from the French colonial powers? Well, obviously, we can look at the French gender culture as a source of explanation. The French did not have females represented in their own military. We cannot expect them to actually recruit female in Dahomey. And Also look at the French gender culture, broadly speaking, within society, right? The role of women within the French society at the time, that's also one source of explanation that we can look at. But we can definitely say that we are talking about a deliberate policy from the French here to terminate that practice, right? To disrupt that military practice for maybe one reason. The French probably did not want to glorify, the kingdom of Dahomey that they just defeated, because if you keep the policy on, you kind of, glorifying them, because this was a defining feature of Dahomey Kingdom. You can add a racial bias to that as well, if you want to go one step further. Another reason maybe, they did this deliberately because they wanted to use a divide and conquer tactics. In fact, there are other kingdoms in the region, Porto Novo, Ketu, that were fighting Abomey as well. So if you glorify Dahomey or you keep on the defining feature as a policy, well, your allies in Porto Novo and Ketu may not be necessarily happy about that. So there's a possibility here to look at that as well. Now, Benin became independent in 1960. The French officially are no longer in charge. We have now Benin nationals in charge. We can now expect them to go back to the older practice of having women in the military. Well, guess what? For the first 15 years at least, no, didn't happen, okay? And you can tell, from the data we have that between 1960 and 1972, I'm focusing here on the first 12 years because it's a specific period of Benin history, very unstable, a lot of military regimes, and even though you had those military folks in charge of running the country, they did not recruit female in the military. So why is that? Well, continuation of colonial policy. I think Malufu referred to that in the area of film and culture. You see the same trend here as well, that they took charge and did not really think through how to actually break, with the past. That did not happen in the first years. 1972, there was the last military coup of the period, and Keoku and his military regime came to power, stayed on for 18 years. The first 2 years, nothing happened, even though they recruited military soldiers, but there were no female. But in 1974, at the end of 1974, we had the very first female recruitment into the military. A total of 18 female on record. And the coming years, every year they tended to have about 10%, 2 enrollments per year, general enrollments, male and female. And on records, what we have is about 10%, at least at the beginning. And then in the subsequent years, it declined a little bit, lower than 10%, on average 5%. But the last military enrollment of this 18-year period was in 1985 for financial reasons. After 85, the military regime stopped bringing in civil servants and military recruits all together. So the last one took place in 1985, and we know also of the 500 people that were recruited that year, 10% were female, okay? Now, one feature we know from history is that in Dahomey, we had not only female warriors, but we have female in position of leadership, right? And that's something we should also expect in these years. Well, between 1974 and 1990, there were only 3 female officers in Benin, okay? 3 of them. I spoke with one of them a few days ago.
Out of how many?
3 out of several hundreds. Let's just put it that way because we don't have the total number at this point. But yeah, several hundred officers in the military and only 3. And we can talk about the history because I spoke with one of them and try to get a sense of what they went through. And one of them was a medical doctor trained in France. She joined in 1975 as part of the very first cohort of female enrolled in the military. And the other 2 were more in public administration, and they joined the military in 1976. and were interestingly trained in North Korea. Okay, and the lady I spoke with actually told me, I asked her, were there other female in North Korea when you trained there as an officer? And she was, yeah. North Korea had, an army where female were represented, actually. So an interesting fact here. So what explains the surge, sudden surge under the 18-year period of Kerekou and his military regime? And I'm trying to just offer a few explanations here. My first guess is that this policy was rooted in the Marxist-Leninist ideology of the Kerekou regime. I mean, the PRPB, as we call them, regime. And you can see the coincidence here. 1974 was when the regime declared itself, or declared the, let's say, the Marxist-Leninist ideology as the guiding ideology. And the same year, they started recruiting female. Coincidence, I don't know, but definitely something to look into. But the other coincidence is that that's the declaration of Marxist-Leninist ideology. The speech was actually given in Abomey, the capital city of Dahomey, at the same place in Goho where we now have the statue of Béhanzin, who was basically the figure of fighting against the invaders. So there's some nationalist / Marxist Leninist ideology here at play that may have explained why they decided suddenly to actually start recruiting female soldiers into the military. Now, we can also ask ourselves, good that they started recruiting female soldiers, but why so few officers, right? Only 3, as we said. My sense, and after speaking with, from my own experience, and after speaking with one of the 3 pioneers, is that one, there was too little or a lack of incentives for female with or qualified female to join the military, and then be able to, qualify for officer training. She was telling me a story that when she encouraged her other friends at the university, because they were college students, to join the military, her response, one of her friends' response was, I don't think that's for women. This is men's job. I'm not that strong. You an athlete, you probably will survive in that environment. I'm not joining. And another one told me, a younger one told me when she encouraged her friends to join when she was trying to join, the answer was, well, you join the military, you have high school, you're now in college, and you go join the military. Guess what you'll be doing there? Serving food to male officers. I'm not doing that. So the society did not provide enough incentives for people or women with qualifications to actually join the military rather than pursuing the college degree, okay? And there was also this more general stereotype about the military in Benin still exists. People will tell you, well, the military is more for uneducated people. If you tell them you're in the military, it's probably because you did not succeed in school. That's why you joined the military. And well, if there are people still thinking that, a good example, hey, look here, I'm standing here, and the interpreter we had since yesterday is a captain, active duty captain, a younger mentee of mine. So just to tell you, that stereotypes still exist. We're trying to show otherwise. All right, and for women, there was also a problem of representation, right? If you don't want to join because you haven't seen anybody before you, an officer, where do you get the incentives? Where do you get the motivation, right? So in that regard, representation does matter for issues like this. And the last point is that Benin, for a long time, Benin, and not just Benin, many other African countries, they did not have officer schools. I joined in 1995. I was trained in Germany, and many were trained in France, in other African countries. So for a long time, Benin did not have officer training. Now think about this. If the French did not have female officers in the military, how many spots do you think they will allocate to Benin to send female soldiers to train as officers? So that also was a constraint on the military in Benin. All right, let's jump to post-military dictatorship. 1990, Benin democratized, and from data we got from BIO 2021 is actually one of the female officers. She did her master's degree recently, last year, in Cameroon when she was doing her war college. I will talk a little bit more about that if you want. But she, in her master, she's provides some data saying in 1990 there were about 3% of female overall in the Benin military. Now, from history, I know from my own experience. Remember, I said the last enrollment occurred in 1985. It took 8 years to resume military enrollments in Benin. So 1993, we had the first one, and about 8.4% of those recruits were female. And the next year, there were two, which I'm part of. About 6.8% or 6.9% were female. And 95, 96, there were two recruitment cohorts as well, same percentage roughly, if you will, 8%. And that percentage remained kind of constant through 2011. Now, remember I'm talking about enrollments generally, but I want to focus on female in position of leadership, especially the officer category. So what happened with that? Well, 2001, Benin eventually opened the door, domestic doors to train officers at home. And about 20 plus students, about 30 I would say, were selected to be part of that very first cohort at home. Now, how many do you think of those were women? None. Because, yes, we've waited for so long to have our own officer school. Let's not give spots away to women. Sorry, my language, but kind of, you see my point here. So yeah, and for the very first three cohorts or four maybe, there were no female part of that. The first cohort of female officers beyond the first generation of the three that I spoke about graduated or were commissioned in 2004. And they were trained in Libya under Gaddafi. And they were trained in Libya under Gaddafi. And, Gaddafi had an all-female bodyguard, bodyguard corps, if you didn't know that. But they were trained in Libya. So there were 5 of them that represented the second generation of female officers in Benin. Here I'm trying to show you just an overview of the present day representation, gender representation within the Benin Army. So this is just Army data, not Air Force, doesn't include Air Force, Navy, but just Army. I had, luckily have access to the actual data. And you can see per category here that, for officers, about 12% of officers in the Army today are female, and non-commissioned officers, 10%, and lower ranks, 12%, okay? And I want to zoom in the 12%, because think about, we had first generation only 3 out of several hundreds, second generation 5 out of several hundreds, and now suddenly today we have 12% out of several hundreds, which is still not bad at all for officers. So I want to zoom in a little bit to, for you to look at the trends. And if you look at the other side all the way on the left, this is for senior officers, again, within the Army. Of course, generals, there's 0 because, for a long time there were no female officers. Same for colonel. Lieutenant colonel, the first cohort, the very first cohort, the first generation that I spoke about, all retired in 2011, 2010. So that's gone. The second generation are now lieutenant colonel and major. That's why you see here about 3%, right, of lieutenant colonels. Major 2.5% about. So roughly, that's the second generation that is now moving up the ladder of promotion. Now, if you look at the next figure right here, you will see that starting with captain is much higher, right, 17%, but interestingly, 35% for second lieutenant. So we've come a long way from 0.0000% to 35% of officers being female. That, to me, is a long progress. Okay, now you may be asking yourself, why is that? Well, part of the explanation has to do with this, and I need you to take a deep breath when you see this. So this is a cadet school created in Benin, all female. They're selected among the brightest after primary school, 6 years of school. They select the brightest and send them to this all-female school and train them, and they attend, secondary school until they graduate from high school while doing military training. We have the same for boys, which I was, part of, I graduated from. It took a long time before they created the girls' school. So you see now we have a source that can provide qualified women that graduate from high school, that join the military and become officers. This part explains why you see now, junior officers, the rates are much, much higher. I'm told here I can't take more time. And yeah, I think I'll keep this for the discussions, recommendations. If you want to touch on any of these, we'll talk about it. Thank you.